The town of Willow Creek sat cradled by dense forests and rolling hills, its beauty almost too perfect to be real. Rows of charming houses lined the cobblestone streets, each one adorned with neatly trimmed gardens and colorful flower beds. Children laughed as they rode their bikes, their carefree voices echoing down the quiet lanes. Life in Willow Creek moved at a gentle pace, as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of its people. Here, everyone knew each other's name, their family history, and often even what they'd had for breakfast. It was a place where nothing stayed a secret for long, or so everyone believed. Yet beneath the postcard perfect scenery, an invisible thread of stagnation wound through the town. The same faces, the same stories, the same routines year after year. It was comforting for some, but suffocating for others. Ethan Harper, the town's beloved police officer, embodied everything Willow Creek held dear. Broad-shouldered and clean-cut, he carried an air of calm authority wherever he went. Whether it was helping an elderly resident cross the street or breaking up a dispute at the local diner, Ethan was always there, dependable as the sunrise. The townsfolk saw him as a pillar of strength, a man who kept their little world in perfect balance. He had moved to Willow Creek nearly a decade ago, leaving behind the chaos of city life for a quieter existence. It didn't take long for him to become one of their own. He's the kind of man you can count on, they would say. A protector. Ethan's polished reputation extended beyond his uniform. He was the husband of Grace Harper, the town's adored schoolteacher, and together they were the perfect picture of small-town bliss. Or so it seemed. At home, Ethan and Grace's life appeared as flawless as the town's manicured lawns. Grace, with her warm smile and kind eyes, was adored by her students and their parents alike. She was often seen at the town library, organizing book drives or chatting with neighbors at the bakery. Their mornings began with coffee on the porch, Grace reading from her favorite novel, while Ethan scanned the local paper. In public, they were inseparable, attending town events hand in hand, drawing admiration from everyone around them. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to form in their carefully curated life. Grace's eyes often drifted to the horizon, her thoughts miles away from Willow Creek. She longed for something more. More excitement, more culture, more life. The small town, with its endless predictability, felt like a gilded cage. Why would anyone want to leave this place? Ethan would say, whenever she hinted at traveling or moving to a bigger city. We've got everything we need right here. His words, though loving on the surface, carried an undercurrent of control. Grace knew he didn't want her to leave, didn't want their perfect life disrupted. But what Ethan saw as stability, she saw as suffocation. Their disagreements were subtle but growing. A pause too long during dinner, a sigh left unanswered, a fleeting glance that spoke volumes. Grace's frustration simmered just below the surface, her dreams quietly clashing with Ethan's contentment. The argument that night had started small. A comment about Grace spending too much time daydreaming instead of focusing on the here and now. It escalated quickly, their voices cutting through the otherwise quiet house. I just need some air, Grace said finally, grabbing her coat and heading for the door. Grace, wait, Ethan started, but she was already gone. The night outside was still and cold, the moon casting long shadows across the winding paths of Willow Creek. Grace walked briskly, her breath visible in the crisp air. The town seemed to sleep around her, its comforting quiet a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Ethan paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. She'd never stayed out this long before. He tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Unease twisted in his gut. Finally, unable to wait any longer, he grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the night. The familiar streets seemed unfamiliar now, each shadow too dark, each rustle of leaves too loud. His search led him to the riverbank, where the gentle current reflected the pale moonlight. That's when he saw it, Grace's scarf, caught in the branches of a bush, fluttering eerily in the breeze. "Grace?" His voice cracked as he called out, the only answer the whisper of the river and the creak of the trees. By morning the news had spread. Grace Harper was missing. The town, so used to its steady rhythm, was thrown into chaos. Neighbors gathered in hushed circles, speculation running wild. Search parties were formed, scouring the woods and riverbanks for any trace of her, Ethan. Once the town's symbol of stability, now stood as a man on the verge of collapse. His desperation was palpable, his voice raw as he begged for answers. But with every hour that passed without a sign of Grace, whispers began to creep into the conversations. Whispers of foul play. Whispers that the perfect couple might not have been so perfect after all. And so, the once idyllic town of Willow Creek began to unravel, its secrets threatening to surface. The morning air was thick with unease as Willow Creek gathered near the town square. Men and women, young and old, stood solemnly, their faces lined with worry. Deputy Harris, clipboard in hand, divided the search teams, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "We'll comb the woods, the riverbank, and every trail from here to the old mill," Harris instructed. Ethan Harper stood at the forefront, his jaw clenched tight. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes red from sleepless nights. He nodded without speaking, the grief weighing heavily on his shoulders. Grace's students, too young to join the search, gathered by the riverbank, leaving notes and wildflowers where her scarf had been found. Their childish handwriting spelled out messages of hope. "Come home, Mrs. Harper. We miss you." Ethan's chest tightened at the sight, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had a job to do. The first few days had been fueled by adrenaline and determination. Volunteers scoured every inch of the forest, their calls for Grace echoing through the trees. But as days stretched into weeks, hope began to fray. The search parties dwindled, replaced by quiet resignation. Ethan, however, couldn't stop. Under the pale light of the moon, he paced the riverbank alone, the water lapping at the shore like a cruel reminder. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but shadows. "She's out there," he muttered to himself, his voice raw with desperation. "She has to be." The emptiness of the night answered him with silence. Ethan's composure, once his defining trait, began to crack. At the station, he grilled witnesses relentlessly, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "You must have seen something," he demanded of an elderly neighbor. "Anything at all?" The woman shook her head, trembling. "I told you, Officer Harper. I was asleep." Deputy Harris pulled Ethan aside. "You need to back off. People are scared, Ethan." "I don't care," Ethan snapped, his voice echoing through the station. "Grace is out there, and I'm not going to stop until I find her." Back home, his rage boiled over. A framed picture of him and Grace on their honeymoon shattered against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stood amid the wreckage, his heart pounding with fury and grief. The town's whispers started quietly at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. "Strange, isn't it?" one neighbor murmured to another. How does a woman just vanish without a trace? You don't think Ethan? I'm just saying. You never really know someone, do you? Ethan felt the shift in the town's gaze. Where once there had been sympathy, now there was suspicion. Conversations hushed when he approached. Neighbors avoided eye contact, their smiles strained. The weight of the judgment pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Even his closest friends began to distance themselves. One evening, his longtime friend and fellow officer, Mark, stopped by Ethan's house. You okay? Mark asked gently. Ethan didn't answer. He stared out the window, his expression hard. Look, Ethan, Mark continued. I'm worried about you. We all are. Maybe you should take a step back, get some rest. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't need rest. I need answers. Pushing everyone away isn't going to bring Grace back, Mark said softly. Ethan's voice was cold. You can leave now. Mark hesitated, then nodded. Take care of yourself, Ethan. As the door closed behind him, Ethan felt another piece of his world crumble. The house was too quiet now, filled only with ghosts of the past. Ethan sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The scent of Grace's perfume lingered faintly in the air, a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Memories flooded his mind, Grace laughing as they danced in the kitchen, her eyes bright with joy. Her voice, soft and melodic, singing along to the radio as she cooked dinner. Their wedding day, her smile radiant as she promised forever. The warmth of those moments contrasted sharply with the cold emptiness of the present, intensifying his torment. Ethan stood at the riverbank once more, the wind biting at his skin. The water glimmered under the fading light. Deceptively peaceful. I'll find you, Grace, he whispered, his voice breaking. No matter what it takes. The town, once a place of comfort, had become a prison of judgment and suspicion, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the truth. As the current swirled before him, Ethan made a silent vow. He wouldn't stop searching, even if it destroyed him. Mira Jensen stepped off the bus with a quiet confidence, her boots hitting the gravel road of Willow Creek. The small town, nestled in the valley between towering hills and dense forests, looked picturesque, almost too perfect. Yet, there was an underlying tension that Mira could feel in the cool breeze, brushing against her cheek. Mira wasn't like the locals. She was a journalist, known for digging deep, often uncovering the hidden truths that people wanted to stay buried. Her arrival was met with cautious curiosity. Whispers traveled fast in a town like this, and already some were wondering what the outsider was doing here. As she walked down the main street, her sharp eyes took in every detail. The quiet cafe, the sleepy antique shop, the church that seemed to dominate the center of town. But it wasn't the scenery that caught her attention. It was the way the townsfolk reacted to her. Eyes lowered, hurried conversations that ended when she passed by. Mira's first visit was to the local diner, a place where the town's residents gathered every morning. She slid into a booth, her pen ready, notebook open. The elderly waitress, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled a coffee cup, glanced at Mira but didn't speak. How's the town holding up? Mira asked, keeping her tone casual. The woman hesitated. People are upset. They don't know what to believe anymore. Mira nodded, sensing the rift that had formed. There were no clear answers, only suspicions, and each conversation she had only deepened the divide. Ethan Harper, once the town's hero, was now at the center of it all. Mira's investigation began by speaking with those who had been closest to Grace. She had no shortage of interviews lined up. But it was Ethan Harper's account of the night his wife disappeared that immediately raised red flags. A young woman, Sarah, who had been one of Grace's students, told Mira that Ethan's version of events didn't quite line up with the details she remembered hearing from the sheriff's office. Mr. Harper said Grace left for a walk around 10 p.m. Right, Sarah said, her voice shaky. But my mom heard them arguing around 8:30. It was loud, really loud. Mira's pen moved swiftly across the page. And you're sure about the time? Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. I remember because I couldn't sleep. It was close to the time the news came on. Mira's instincts kicked in. The timeline wasn't adding up. Ethan's story about Grace's departure and the timeline of her disappearance seemed too neat, too rehearsed. And yet, the inconsistencies were piling up. When Mira confronted Ethan about these discrepancies, his calm demeanor was unsettling. He spoke slowly, carefully, his gaze unwavering. People hear things, Mira. Doesn't mean they're right. But the slight shift in his eyes told a different story. There was something Ethan wasn't sharing. Determined to uncover the truth, Mira's search took her beyond the sleepy confines of Willow Creek to the city where Ethan had worked as a police officer before moving back to town. The city hall records were sealed, but Mira's persistence paid off. She managed to gain access to internal files detailing complaints against Ethan. Allegations of misconduct stretched back several years, and accusations of excessive force, intimidation tactics, and even a few complaints from the department about Ethan's temper. Mira's stomach twisted as she read through the details. This was a side of Ethan no one in Willow Creek seemed to know. She arranged to speak with some of Ethan's former colleagues who spoke of a man with a dark side, someone who could charm a room 1 minute and then silence it with his anger the next. One officer, a man named Tom, was particularly candid. Ethan was a good cop until he wasn't. People started getting scared of him. He got real possessive of his cases and of the people in his life. Mira's pen scratched across her notebook as she made connections between the past and present. Ethan had a history, a pattern of controlling behavior that had followed him. Back in Willow Creek, Mira continued her investigation into Ethan and Grace's marriage. Conversations with Grace's close friends revealed more cracks in the picture-perfect couple. One of Grace's childhood friends, Laura, hesitated before speaking. Grace never told me much, but there were times when I'd visit, I'd see how tense things could be. Ethan would get real quiet, real controlling. Mira leaned in, sensing the weight of Laura's words. What do you mean by controlling? Laura glanced around nervously, then lowered her voice. Grace would talk about wanting more than Willow Creek could give her. I think Ethan knew. He didn't like it. He wanted her to be happy, but on his terms. Mira's eyes flicked to the small stack of papers in front of her. One of those papers was a journal entry from Grace, tucked in between photographs of their life together. I'm scared. I want to leave, but I can't. I'm trapped. Mira felt her pulse quicken. Grace had been afraid, trapped in a life she couldn't escape. The pieces were coming together. It was an old woman, Mrs. Hayes, a reclusive neighbor who had lived next to the Harpers for years. She finally spoke up. I've heard them fight. A lot. Mrs. Hayes murmured from the safety of her front porch. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but you can't ignore it when the windows are open. Mira's heart raced as Mrs. Hayes detailed arguments between Ethan and Grace. Heated, loud, and often. The most chilling part of the story was when Mrs. Hayes mentioned a particularly violent argument that had taken place just days before Grace disappeared. There was a shouting match that Thursday night. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I heard it again the next night, I knew something was wrong. Mrs. Hayes continued. He was always so calm, so in control. But that night, he sounded like someone else. Mira's breath caught. The pieces were falling into place. As the whispers turned into accusations, the police department took action. Ethan was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation. The news hit the town like a lightning strike. The man who had been their protector was now a suspect. One by one, people in town began to pull away. His fellow officers no longer met him with the same respect, their eyes cold whenever he entered the room. Ethan had lost everything: his badge, his reputation, his place in the community. His isolation deepened, and the once proud man now seemed like a shell of himself, his every movement tinged with desperation. Mira's determination to uncover the truth kept her in Willow Creek, despite the growing tension and the hostility from some residents. The more she dug, the darker the truth became. She continued to piece together a story of a marriage marred by control and violence, a man whose public persona had concealed a much darker reality. But there was still more to uncover, more questions without answers. Mira refused to back down, even when the town turned against her. She was close, too close to let it slip away. The truth was unraveling. Ethan, once revered, was now viewed with suspicion and fear. His reputation, built over years of service, was crumbling before his eyes. Mira's investigation had peeled back layer after layer, revealing the disturbing reality of Ethan's life. With each revelation, the town's trust in him shattered, leaving only the broken remnants of a once proud man. As the town turned its back on him, Ethan stood at the center of the storm, his carefully built image falling apart, piece by piece. And in the quiet of his broken world, the full weight of his actions began to settle in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the small, secluded house at the edge of town. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face hard and unreadable as Mira approached, her steps slow and deliberate. She'd spent days gathering evidence, piecing together the truth that everyone else had been too afraid to uncover. Mira, Ethan greeted her coldly, his voice lacking the warmth that had once defined him. Ethan, we need to talk, Mira said firmly, not waiting for him to invite her inside. She held up a manila folder thick with evidence. It was time to end the lies. Ethan's eyes flickered with something like fear, but he quickly masked it with defiance. I don't have time for this. Whatever you think you know, it's not what happened. Mira stepped closer, her eyes steady and unwavering. You're not going to talk your way out of this, Ethan. Not anymore. She opened the folder. This is the truth about your marriage, about Grace, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. A flash of anger sparked in Ethan's eyes, his jaw tightening. You think you know everything, but you don't. You have no idea what it's like to live with the guilt, to carry the weight of losing someone you love. The walls around him were crumbling. Mira pressed on. Then why don't you tell me the truth? What happened between you and Grace? His hands clenched into fists, his body stiffening. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes darting away, as if searching for an escape. But the silence spoke volumes. Mira's voice softened. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to understand. Tell me, Ethan. What happened? Ethan's voice broke through the silence, thick with emotion. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I loved Grace, I really did. But we were falling apart, Mira. The last few months before she disappeared, everything between us, it was falling apart. Mira remained still, letting his words hang in the air. Ethan's eyes were distant now, the memories pulling him back into a past he couldn't escape. I saw it. She didn't want this life anymore. This town, this house, this... me. His voice cracked, but he kept going. Grace had dreams. She wanted more. But I couldn't let go. I thought if I just kept holding on, it would work. I didn't want to lose her. I couldn't. Dan's face twisted with a mix of regret and shame as he continued. I tried to control everything. Her life, her decisions. I told myself it was because I loved her. But it wasn't. It was because I was scared. Scared of losing her. I pushed her too hard. A flicker of guilt washed over his features, and his voice dropped to a whisper. I made her feel like she couldn't breathe. Mira listened intently, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. But there was still one thing that needed to be addressed. I never hurt her. Ethan spat, his eyes burning with intensity. Not physically. Not like that. I never raised a hand to her. You have to believe me. Mira could see the desperation in his eyes, the desperate need to clear his name. Ethan's fists clenched as memories flooded back. Flashback. Ethan and Grace, their voices raised in a heated argument, his words sharp, cruel. Grace, standing by the door, trying to leave, but Ethan grabbing her arm, just enough to keep her from walking away. I never hit her, Mira. But God, I wanted to. I wanted to control everything, her choices, her future. I thought if I could do that, if I could make her stay, things would be better. I thought it was love. Mira could feel the truth in his words, the guilt that ate away at him. It wasn't just the physical control that had destroyed the marriage. It was the emotional manipulation, the suffocating grip he'd tried to hold on her life. Mira paused for a moment, allowing the weight of Ethan's confession to settle before she revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Ethan, there's something else. Something you didn't know about. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small device, a camera. This footage was taken the night Grace disappeared. It's from a wildlife camera near the riverbank. Ethan's face paled as Mira clicked a button on the camera, and the grainy footage flickered to life. The screen showed a dark figure moving along the riverbank, a flash of Grace's hair visible in the dim light. Mira's voice was steady, but urgent. That's Grace. And that person? That's her former lover. He came back to town, Ethan. He was here, and he was with her that night. Ethan's eyes widened as the footage continued. The tension in his body grew. I don't understand. What is this? What happened to her? The footage played out, showing Grace meeting the mysterious figure at the edge of the river. The two exchanged words in the darkness, their voices faint but unmistakable. Then, a sudden movement. Grace stepped back too far, slipping on the slick riverbank. Her body tumbled, crashing against the rocks, and before she could react, the current swept her away. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the screen went black. Mira sat still, her gaze fixed on him. The truth was undeniable. It wasn't you, Ethan, she whispered. It was an accident. Grace didn't die because of you. Ethan sank to his knees, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. The truth that had haunted him for so long, the truth he never allowed himself to believe, was finally here. The tears that Ethan had fought to hold back for so long began to fall freely. his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. "I thought I killed her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought it was my fault. I thought I pushed her too far." Mira, seeing the pain in his eyes, softened. She had uncovered the dark truth, but she also saw the man who was lost, the man who had carried the weight of his mistakes for too long. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just the man who had lost his wife. He was the man who had loved her, deeply and desperately. And now, the guilt he had carried for so long was slowly transforming into sorrow. "I didn't want this," he sobbed. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt her." Mira stood, her heart heavy for him. "I know, but it wasn't your fault. It was a tragic accident." Mira stood up, her hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll tell the town the truth. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Ethan nodded, his eyes red but resolute. "I've done so many things wrong, Mira, but I'll make this right. I'll honor Grace's memory, even if it means facing everything I've done." As Mira walked out the door, the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. The town would learn the truth soon enough, but for Ethan, the real journey was just beginning. Toward redemption, toward healing, and toward forgiving himself for a past he could never undo. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs as the judge's gavel fell, signaling the official end of the proceedings. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly in his lap, as the judge cleared him of any wrongdoing in Grace's death. The air in the room felt heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Mira, standing by the door, watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. She had done her job, exposing the truth, but she couldn't ignore the bittersweet taste that lingered in the air. Ethan was free of guilt, but it was clear that freedom would never come without consequences. Outside the courthouse, the town's eyes were still on Ethan. The relief in the courtroom didn't extend to the streets, the whispers, the side glances, the lingering distrust. He could feel them all. Even though the law had cleared his name, the town's heart hadn't forgiven him. As Ethan walked toward his car, he noticed a few familiar faces from the past, former friends and colleagues. Their eyes met his, but the smiles they once shared now felt like memories of someone else. No one approached him. No one offered a handshake, not even a nod. His presence was like an awkward silence between them. Ethan lowered his head, the sting of rejection more painful than he expected. Despite the verdict, there would be no easy road back to redemption in the eyes of the people he had once protected. The office was quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of papers on Ethan's desk. His badge lay in front of him, small, round, the symbol of years of service. His hand hovered over it, trembling slightly before he picked it up. The weight of the metal felt different now, heavier, almost suffocating. Ethan stared at the badge, remembering the pride he had once felt when he first put it on. The badge no longer felt like a symbol of honor, but of mistakes, of choices he couldn't take back. He stood up and walked to the bulletin board in the corner of the room, where his resignation letter was already prepared. His colleagues had already heard the rumors. Ethan would step down, though no one had said it outright. With a final glance at the badge, he slowly removed it from his chest. The motion felt unnatural, like he was shedding part of his soul, something he couldn't quite put back together. Ethan placed the badge on the desk, his fingers lingering on the edge before he pulled away, walking out of the office for the last time. Back at her apartment, Mira sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had the truth, every piece of it laid out before her. Yet the words she typed came slowly, as though each one carried the weight of the entire story. Her article was more than just a report. It was an exploration of Grace's life, the turmoil of her marriage, and the terrible tragedy that unfolded on the night she disappeared. But it wasn't just about Ethan. It was about a man struggling with his own demons, trying to hold on to a life he couldn't control. As Mira typed, she paused, her mind wandering to Ethan. She understood now. The heart of his story was not just about guilt and blame, but about the haunting complexity of love and loss. She couldn't erase his mistakes, but she could acknowledge his journey. She finished the article with a final, reflective sentence. Ethan's redemption lies not in absolution, but in the willingness to confront the darkness within himself and to seek a path forward even when the world refuses to forgive. Mira hit publish, and as the words went live, she knew they would change everything. Some would see Ethan's side, while others would never look at him the same again. But for Mira, the power of truth was something she would always cherish, no matter how complicated it made things. The first day after the article's publication was tense, but then something shifted. It started with a wave from Mrs. Larson, an elderly woman who had been one of Ethan's most vocal critics. She waved from across the street as he walked to the small grocery store, her hand trembling slightly as she nodded at him. Later that day, a man from the local diner, once a close friend of Ethan's, stood at the counter and asked if Ethan wanted a cup of coffee. It wasn't much, but it was a sign, a small gesture of goodwill. Ethan stood outside the diner for a moment, letting the warmth of the offer seep into his bones. He hadn't expected it. Not from them, not after everything that had happened. But something had begun to shift. A fragile bridge was forming between him and the town he once called home. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start. Weeks passed, and Ethan began to take small steps toward healing. His first day volunteering at the youth center was nerve-wracking, but the kids, disconnected, angry, and hurt, gave him no judgment. They just listened. Ethan stood before a group of troubled teens, his voice softer than usual as he shared his story. His mistakes, his regrets, the times he let his anger cloud his better judgment. "I was where you are," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing, and I made choices that hurt the people I loved." The teens watched him, their eyes wide, some skeptical, others curious. But when the session ended, one of them approached him, offering a simple, sincere handshake. Ethan's eyes softened as he took the hand. The feeling was unfamiliar, like a small redemption, one step at a time. Maybe he could make a difference. Maybe he could still protect people, but this time, in a way that mattered. Mira stood outside the coffee shop, her suitcase beside her, her eyes lingering on the town one last time. She had done what she came to do. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to leave. Ethan walked up to her, his face a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I can't thank you enough for everything, Mira," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me a chance to be seen for who I really am, not just for my mistakes." Mira smiled, her heart heavy. "You earned it, Ethan. It wasn't easy, but you're on the right path now." She paused, searching his face for a moment. "Take care of yourself, and take care of this town." With a final hug, she turned and walked toward her car, her mind already on the road ahead. But she knew she'd never forget Ethan, or the lessons they had both learned along the way. Ethan stood by the riverbank once again, the place where Grace had slipped away. He closed his eyes, the cool wind brushing against his face, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Grace's memory still lingered in the air, but it wasn't just sorrow that filled the space. It was a quiet understanding. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the weight of everything he had learned settle into his chest. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. The town, though fractured, was beginning to heal, and so was he. The years had changed Ethan. His hair had grayed, his shoulders a little stooped, and the lines on his face were deeper than they once were. He stood at the window of his small house, looking out at the quiet street that had once been so full of life, now calm in its routine. The weight of the past still lingered with him, but it no longer consumed him. Ethan had spent many nights reflecting on the choices he made, choices that had led to Grace's tragic death. He remembered the anger, the fear, the mistakes. He had lived in grief for so long, buried under guilt and shame, that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to forgive himself. But time had a way of teaching hard lessons, and slowly the darkness began to fade. His journey, from the depths of loss to the fragile strength he carried now, was nothing short of transformation. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that courtroom years ago, desperate for exoneration. He was stronger, more aware, and deeply changed. But that change had come with hard work, the kind of work that peeled back layers of pride and shame, exposing the raw truth beneath. The road to self-awareness had been long, but Ethan had learned the most important lesson of all. Healing wasn't something given, it was something earned. Ethan stood at the edge of the riverbank, the same place where Grace had slipped away so many years ago. The weathered path was familiar, yet it felt different today. Time had softened its harsh edges, and now wildflowers bloomed along its sides. The memorial stone sat nestled among them, a quiet tribute to Grace's life. He walked slowly toward it, his heart thudding in his chest, but this time there was no overwhelming sadness, no crushing guilt. The sound of the river, which had once echoed with grief, now seemed soothing, like a song of release, washing away the remnants of pain that still clung to his soul. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, vibrant against the earth's backdrop. It was as though life had returned here, in this place where once everything had felt lost. The passage of time had brought renewal, and Ethan could feel it deep inside himself. He wasn't sure how it had happened, but as he stood there, the river flowing beside him, he knew he had found peace. Ethan knelt beside the memorial, his hand brushing the cool stone, his fingers trembling slightly. Grace's absence had shaped him in ways he hadn't understood at first. Her loss had been the catalyst for his change, the jolt that had forced him to confront the worst parts of himself. He remembered her, her laugh, her spirit, the way she made him feel like they could conquer the world. But their love had been fractured by his mistakes. In losing her, Ethan had found the courage to face the man he had become. It was painful to admit how much of that man had been driven by control and fear. But Grace's memory had pushed him to let go of that, to break free from the darkness and embrace the light he had long buried. Her influence was still with him, quietly guiding him through each day. Grace had been more than just a wife. She had been a force that challenged him to be better, even when he couldn't see it. And now, in her absence, she had forced him to become someone worthy of the love she had once given him. Ethan's mind drifted to Mira, the journalist who had exposed the truth when no one else dared. Her article had been a turning point, not only for him but for the town. The town had learned to see him differently, not as the man who had been suspected of causing Grace's death, but as a flawed, real person. People had stopped treating him with disdain. Some even nodded as they passed him on the street now, the eyes less filled with judgment. Though forgiveness wasn't something he could demand, the town had begun to understand his story. It wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It was about the complexities of life, of marriage, of human imperfection. And Mira had told that story, weaving in the raw truth and the emotion that no one else could have. Ethan was forever grateful for that, for the way she had given him the chance to redeem not just himself, but how the town saw him. Ethan reached down and picked a single wildflower, its petals soft and delicate against his rough hand. With quiet reverence, he placed it at the base of the memorial stone, his heart heavy, but full of gratitude. He had not come here to ask for forgiveness. He had come here to remember, to honor Grace, and to make peace with the past. As the wind picked up, rustling through the flowers around him, he whispered a quiet promise, one that only he would hear. "I'll keep going," he murmured softly. "I'll live in a way that honors you, Grace. I'll keep your memory alive, no matter where life takes me." The words felt right. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like an apology. They felt like a commitment, a vow to keep growing, to never forget what Grace had taught him. Ethan stood up slowly, his knees creaking with the effort, but the weight on his chest was gone. He turned away from the memorial, the wind catching in his hair, the wildflowers still swaying around him. As he walked away, the river whispered behind him, a constant, soothing presence. His journey was far from over. He knew that. But for the first time, he was walking forward with purpose. There would still be challenges, still moments of doubt and grief, but there was also hope. He had learned to accept his flaws, to face his past, and to continue moving forward one step at a time. And as he walked back down the path, the sun breaking through the clouds above, he realized that even after all the pain and loss, there was beauty to be found in the healing. The wildflowers, bright, resilient, and full of life, were a reminder that even after profound loss, there was always the possibility of new beginnings. Ethan smiled softly, a quiet peace settling within him. He was no longer running from his past. Instead, he was learning to embrace it, and in doing so, he was finding the man he had always been meant to be.